Hi, this is Dr. K from Holistic Kids and Families. I'm here today to talk to you about MTHFR, the boss gene. MTHFR is yoked, it's strong, it's so buffed, and it's of great concern to so many people because it's been tied to so many different things, from high blood pressure and cardiovascular risk to autism to ADHD to autoimmunity to gut issues, Down syndrome. And if you're a parent like I am, you're really concerned about this gene because it may actually be tied to autism, and in some cases it's thought to increase the risk of developing autism if you have this gene. And you keep looking, you find really concerning information, such as children with autism generally have a higher risk of having this gene. So you start wondering, like, oh my God, if my child has this gene, will they go on to develop autism? And then there's discussion about detoxification being tied to this gene, and there are studies out there that suggest that this gene may be causing higher risk of vaccine reactions than those that don't have it. And in this case, there was this study where they looked at 1,400 genes, and of these 1,400 genes, only 2 genes were tied to vaccine reactions regularly, and MTHFR was one of them. Now, in this case, they were looking for fevers, malaise, those kinds of adverse reactions being tied to the smallpox vaccine. So you look at this stuff, you say, oh my God, this is really concerning. Should I be testing my child to see if they have this gene? Because if they do, we shouldn't be vaccinating them. What if they turn autistic? And this is a discussion that it seems that I have to have over and over again with our families, because they look at this information, they're told of this information by their friends, they read about some article, they watch a presentation by someone else, and they're concerned, and they have a right to be, because this information is really troubling. Now, what is MTHFR? Let's look at that and then go on to really explore this concept, because this is something that's really important, and I think parents and most people should be aware of this. So MTHFR is called methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase. It's basically an enzyme that's decoded by the MTHFR gene that helps recycle folate groups, and methylfolate in particular. Methylfolate is basically the oil that helps lubricate our system, and it helps everything run more efficiently. Now, I, for one, am an MTHFR mutant. I have the homozygous C677T, which is one of the genes that's actually fully mutated. So my oil pump basically is 70% less efficient than most other individuals. And when I had checked myself a long time ago for homocysteine, which is one compound that actually gets recycled by this gene, mine was sky high. So I could have been at risk of developing heart disease, I could have been at risk of developing all kinds of things, and it really freaked me out when I found this out. And to this day, I find that probably if I don't take a little bit of folate once per week, I actually start feeling sluggish and tired and just not feeling well. So I can feel the difference when I take supplementation versus when I don't. And you look at articles or diagrams like this one by Amy Yasko, which is brilliant. It really ties together how MTHFR can impact so many things. So on the right of this diagram to the top, it produces SAMe groups, which are basically methyl groups that go into the liver and helps with detoxification. Down below, you look at it, people are talking about how MTHFR is tied to glutathione, which is the master antioxidant within the body. And then to the left of this diagram, where that red arrow is, you can see how MTHFR is tied to compounds like dopamine and serotonin. And as one example of how relevant this information is, I had this one patient a long time ago, 6-7 years ago, when I was consulting at Loma Linda, and this poor child who is 3 years of age had not slept 1 wink in his entire life. Can you imagine that, having a 2.5, 3-year-old that every night from basically noon until, or midnight until 6 or 7 a.m. was just up bouncing in his crib all the time? The parents were about to lose their mind, and rightfully so. Now, one of the things that was really interesting was that this child also had this weird lymphatic malformation where basically the lymph nodes that he had were bulging out like this. And one of my brilliant friends, Kathy Gill, pointed out, like, hey Pageman, by the way, did you realize that that's actually a midline defect? And if you actually looked at most of the literature for methyl defects, methylation defects. They talk about midline defects. So I said to myself, gosh, maybe this kid does actually have this gene mutation, and maybe because serotonin gets converted to melatonin, and melatonin is the compound that helps us sleep, maybe this kid has this mutation. So I said to the parents, like, hey, you guys want to treat this? And the most efficient way to treat MTHFR by blasting the system is to actually do injections of B12 and high doses of folate. So I offered this to the family, and they were willing to try anything, so they said sure. And within 2 nights, I kid you not, 2 nights, this child actually started sleeping for the first time in his life. I had many other cases similar to this where I treated someone and miraculously something shifted in their body. And it got me to the point where I actually started becoming really obsessed with this. And for basically 2 years, I was looking at every piece of information I can find on MTHFR. I started injecting myself with B12 injections, taking gobs of folate, 5 milligrams, which is a lot, and started offering this to patients. I had children with autism that I was giving huge doses for because they had antibodies that prevented folate groups from going into their bodies. And I was offering this, never forcing it, but offering this to families. And there were many people that were interested. And what was really interesting was that the vast majority of people that I treated who had the MTHFR mutation with high doses of methylfolate and B12 did not improve. These people did not improve, and it really had me stuck in a place where I had to ask myself, how is it that if this mutation is tied to all these issues, is tied to asthma, is tied to allergies, and is tied to autism, is tied to these things, and I did these treatments, why is it that these people did not improve the way I thought they would? And I, for myself, did not feel any difference. So I was doing all of these treatments, really hoping that I would have some kind of enormous breakthrough in how my body felt and functioned, and nil. Nothing. The once per week, 1 milligram of methylfolate that I take with a little bit of B12 was helpful as much as these high doses of injections in folate. And when you look at the literature further, you find out that the same person that said that the children with autism have a higher rate of MTHFR mutations than other, goes on to say it is unlikely that this association alone is sufficient and basically capable of producing autism. So this brilliant researcher is talking about it's impossible for MTHFR as one single mutation to create the vast array of symptoms and issues that people with autism have. So is it really the yoked gene that we think it is? And that's what I actually want to question. So look at this. In some populations, up to 30% of the individuals have this mutation, have the homozygous C677T mutation, which is what I have. So in some populations, 30% of the people are mutants. And if that's the case, then 30% of the individuals should be developing autism, should be developing all kinds of weird autoimmune diseases, should be having all kinds of things. We do not see that. And what's actually interesting is also, if let's say 10% of the population has this mutation, then 10% of kids should be having weird adverse reactions to vaccines, and we don't see that. So something is really wrong in this picture, and perhaps this yoked gene is actually not so yoked, and maybe is actually a little bit scrawny. But because it's so easy for us to tie one thing to one thing and then it actually sells stories and convinces people, it's easy to talk about that. But maybe that's not the reality that we have before us. When you look at the methylation pathways, there's 20-something genes at times impacting how these pathways work. So how in God's good earth could one gene by itself wreck these pathways? Not that it isn't important, but is it the key factor in methylation? When we talk about detoxification, there are countless genes in multiple parts of the liver, phases of the liver, I should say, in how they actually break down and process toxins within our body. And MTHFR is one single piece of that huge puzzle. So how can we say that MTHFR causes defects in detoxification when there are so many other genes influencing detoxification. And it turns out that glutathione is actually not even closely related to MTHFR because there's separate pathways that actually are responsible for the production of MTHFR. And while the methyl groups that are produced are important, by no means by themselves are they physiologically the key pieces to drive these pathways. What about vaccines? Well, look at this study that came out of Tulsa, Oklahoma. This same researcher basically looked at the same data set, more or less, that smallpox vaccine study looked at, and what he came up with is that there's a web of interactions of genes, of which MTHFR is one, that actually may be the way the vaccine adverse reactions are happening, meaning you have to have this entire cluster of gene mutations together to create problems. And in fact, the RXRA gene that's all the way in the bottom of this screen, this researcher thinks is actually the most important, which is a retinoid receptor for vitamin D. So this researcher is thinking that one, there's a whole web of interactions, and vitamin D may actually be a pretty key important piece of that. And Dr. Pollan is actually a hero of mine in a certain way, because what this brilliant researcher is looking at is how does this entire web come together to cause or explain vaccine reactions, and how can we understand all of this to basically help prevent people from being injured and harmed. And you know, I wish I could say that vaccines do not cause problems, but they do. I think the only problem is that vaccines are causing problems in probably 0.5, maybe 1% of our population, and most of the time those reactions are not even that severe. But when we do see one isolated case, because it is so tragic and it is so problematic, we take that and blow it up to mean that it is the thing. Every time I vaccinate my child, I'm terribly worried of her having a reaction. And with this last round, she was actually off for a week. She was not sleeping, she was irritable, her entire system was just off. And it took 2 or 3 weeks for her to recover from that. But that doesn't mean that she had some kind of catastrophic reaction. And that doesn't mean that we won't continue to vaccinate her responsibly and slowly. But there are things that we need to be thinking about. MTHFR by itself is by no means the end-all or the explanation to everything. And if you take the conversation of Dr. Pollan further, but wait for it, it turns out that the nervous system, the endocrine system, our hormones, the immune system, and the intestinal tract together are also coming together to impact our entire physiology. So really what we should be looking at is this complex array of interactions where everything is impacting everything, and everything is tied to everything, and everything is influenced by everything. And our genes are just one piece of this puzzle, and MTHFR is one piece of that puzzle. And by no means should we disregard anything, but we should be looking at the entire picture of how toxins and nutrients and our ability to detoxify and how we sleep and our physical body and how that's functioning and the joy we have in our lives and our connections with the heavens above and God knows what else, how all of this is coming together to impact some kind of bad or good outcome. So health is really a web. It's an interaction of multiple things coming together to create a problem or health. And MTHFR is one single dot in this entire web. There is no master to things. And you know, when we look at these things, and part of why I actually discourage our families from genetic testing is we don't know what it means to genetic test a child. You take a child's genes, you put it in the hands of a company. We hope that company is going to be responsible with this information. And I think they have every intention to be. But as we have found out over and over and over again, inadvertent things happen to data. And inadvertently, if your child's DNA suddenly started floating out there, is that something you want? Is that something your child would want if they can't even consent? Long ago, when I started jumping on this bandwagon and I was really convinced that I should be genetic testing all the children, I started talking to this brilliant geneticist who had me really think, and he said, you know what, Pashman? MTHFR, and he knew what MTHFR was. He said MTHFR cannot be predictive of issues or disease. And if it's not predictive of issues or disease, is it the responsible thing to genetic test a child who can't give consent for themselves? We won't know what we'll have in 20 years. We won't know if some individual living then will want to have their genetics out there. As adults, we can consent for it, but what about the child? If you're worried about MTHFR, just make sure that you and your child are eating foods that are rich in folate. If you're worried about that, take a multivitamin that has folate. Thank God there's so many of them out there. And by taking the folate, you're essentially undoing the damage that MTHFR causes. If you want to learn more, go read from the master. Dr. Ben Lynch is the father of MTHFR. Years ago, before anyone even was paying attention, he was talking about it. And what impresses me most about this man who knows so much is that he's not talking about genetic testing. He's not talking about massive doses of supplementation. He's talking about healthful living and eating and just self-care as a way to preserve the body. I want to give credit to my mentor and friend, Dr. Kamyar Hidayat, who opened my eyes to this conversation of the complexity of the human body and the fact that there is no one single factor that by itself influences everything, because it's everything that comes together, and how it comes together is how we have disease and health, and we need to look at that entire matrix. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope that with the information that I've shared you, I've been able to impress upon you some useful information that will hopefully relieve some stress, maybe have taught you something along the way, and hopefully relieve some anxiety and worry. Thank you so much for listening. This is Pejman Katarai, Dr. K from Holistic Kids and Families.